The moment Berlin fell was supposed to mark the final triumph of the Allied victory in Europe. Yet for General George S. Patton, it felt like a surrender of something far greater than territory. As reports confirmed that Berlin had been left to the advancing Soviet forces, Patton did not celebrate. Instead, a deep and bitter frustration settled inside him, the kind that comes when a soldier believes history has taken a wrong turn. To Patton, Berlin was not just a city. It was the symbolic heart of Nazi power, the place where the war in Europe should have ended under Western boots, not behind the iron shadow of another rising force. Patton had long believed that wars were not truly won when enemies were merely defeated, but when the future was secured. As American and British forces raced across Germany in the final months of the war, Patton pushed relentlessly, convinced that speed was everything. He watched his armies advance faster than anyone expected, crushing resistance and opening roads straight toward Berlin. To him, the path was clear. The enemy was collapsing, morale was broken, and the cost of hesitation would be paid later. Yet as Patton looked at the maps, another realization began to sink in. The enemy ahead was no longer just Germany. It was the future balance of power in Europe. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, saw the situation differently. His decisions were shaped not only by military calculations, but by political agreements already made between Allied leaders. Berlin, according to those agreements, lay within the Soviet zone of occupation. Eisenhower believed that diverting forces to take the city would cost thousands of lives for symbolic value alone. To him, the war's true objective was the total destruction of Nazi forces, not a race for prestige. But to Patton, this reasoning felt dangerously short-sighted. He believed wars ended the moment you stopped advancing, not the moment you declared victory. When Patton learned that Eisenhower had chosen to halt the Western advance toward Berlin, allowing Soviet forces to claim it instead, his anger was immediate and intense. In private conversations and diary entries, Patton did not hide his feelings. He believed the decision would reshape Europe in ways that future generations would regret. To him, leaving Berlin was not an act of cooperation, but an act of surrender, handing half of Europe to a new, authoritarian power under the illusion of peace. He felt that Eisenhower had once again chosen political caution over strategic dominance. Patton's words during this period were sharp, emotional, and deeply revealing. He reportedly said that the Allies had defeated the wrong enemy last, implying that while Nazi Germany was crushed, a far greater ideological struggle was being ignored. He believed the Soviet Union was not a true ally, but a temporary partner whose ambitions were clear to anyone willing to see them. Patton argued that the Red Army would not stop at Berlin, and that giving them the city without resistance would only embolden their expansion. These were not words meant for public speeches. They were warnings spoken behind closed doors in moments of raw honesty. The frustration Patton felt was compounded by a sense of déjà vu. This was not the first time he believed Eisenhower had restrained him for political reasons. The humiliation he endured earlier in the war had taught him that brilliance on the battlefield did not always translate into authority over decisions that shaped history. Once again, Patton felt sidelined, his instincts ignored in favor of diplomatic caution. He did not question Eisenhower's loyalty to the Allies, but he questioned whether restraint in victory could be just as dangerous as recklessness in defeat. As Soviet forces entered Berlin and raised their flags over the ruins, Patton reportedly remarked that the Allies had traded one form of tyranny for another. He feared that millions would soon live under oppression, just as harsh as the one they had been liberated from. To Patton, this was a betrayal of the very ideals the war had been fought to protect. Freedom, he believed, was not divisible. Either it was defended everywhere, or it would eventually be threatened everywhere. Leaving Berlin felt like drawing a line that should never have existed. Eisenhower, however, remained firm in his decision. He believed that maintaining unity among the Allies was essential to preventing immediate chaos after the war. Opening conflict with the Soviets, even indirectly, risked plunging Europe into another catastrophic struggle. Eisenhower carried the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders, and he believed restraint was the price of peace. Patton understood the argument, but he did not accept it. To him, peace built on fear of confrontation was temporary at best. In the days that followed, Patton's tone grew darker. He spoke of missed opportunities and warned that future generations would pay for decisions made in the name of convenience. He believed that history would one day reveal that Berlin was not just a city lost, but a turning point where moral clarity was sacrificed for political stability. Patton was not calling for immediate war with the Soviets, but he believed that strength, not concession, was the only language authoritarian powers respected. Yet despite his anger, Patton did not openly defy Eisenhower. He remained a soldier bound by command, loyal to the chain of authority even when it wounded his convictions. This inner conflict tore at him. He was a warrior who believed he could see the storm forming on the horizon, yet he was powerless to change its course. That sense of helplessness weighed heavily on him, more than any battlefield loss ever had. As Europe celebrated the end of the war, Patton felt no peace. Victory parades rang hollow to him. He believed the war had ended too early in spirit, even if it had ended in fact. In his mind, Berlin symbolized a future already compromised. The choices made in those final days would not reveal their consequences immediately, but Patton was convinced they would echo through decades to come. And as Patton reflected on Eisenhower's decision to leave Berlin to the Russians, his thoughts turned from frustration to grim certainty. He believed the next conflict would not be fought with tanks alone, but with ideology, influence, and fear. The battlefield had changed, but the war, in his mind, had not truly ended. This belief would shape his final months, his words, and his legacy, and it would place him once again at odds with the leadership he had served so fiercely. As the dust settled over a shattered Germany, Patton's frustration did not fade with the silence of the guns. Instead, it deepened into something heavier and more unsettling. While the world celebrated victory, Patton felt a growing sense of dread, as if the war had ended on paper but not in reality. He watched Soviet forces consolidate their hold on Eastern Europe, and every report confirmed what he had feared. The Red Army was not behaving like a liberator preparing to leave, but like a power settling in for the long term. To Patton, Berlin was only the beginning, not the end. In private conversations with trusted officers, Patton spoke with an intensity that bordered on prophecy. He warned that the ideological divide between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union was irreconcilable. To him, the temporary alliance had been a matter of necessity, not trust. Now that the common enemy was defeated, Patton believed the true nature of the Soviet system would no longer be hidden. He reportedly said that the Allies had stopped too soon. That momentum once lost could never be recovered without paying a far greater price later. His words were not calls for immediate conflict, but expressions of a soldier's instinct that danger ignored only grows stronger. Patton's anger was sharpened by his belief that the Western armies had the capability to take Berlin first. He knew the condition of German defenses, understood the collapse of their command structure, and believed that a swift, decisive push could have ended the war on Western terms. The argument that taking Berlin would cost too many lives did not fully convince him. In his mind, the cost of not taking it would be measured in decades of division, suffering, and fear. He believed soldiers fought not only to win wars, but to shape the peace that followed. Eisenhower, however, remained resolute. He had made his choice based on agreements with Allied leaders and his responsibility to prevent another catastrophic conflict. To Eisenhower, opening a race to Berlin risked accidental confrontation with Soviet forces, something that could ignite a new war before the old one had fully ended. He believed history would judge restraint more kindly than ambition. Patton understood Eisenhower's logic, but he could not accept it. To Patton, restraint in the face of expansion was not wisdom, but weakness disguised as diplomacy. This difference in worldview created an unbridgeable gap between the two men. Eisenhower looked at the map and saw borders, agreements, and fragile alliances. Patton looked at the same map and saw momentum, opportunity, and future threats. Patton believed that the Soviets respected strength and exploited hesitation. Each mile conceded without pressure, he felt, would only encourage further advances. His frustration was not driven by ego, but by a conviction that history was being written incorrectly. As weeks passed, Patton's comments grew more candid. He openly criticized the idea that peace could be maintained through concessions. He warned that the Soviet system thrived on control and fear, not cooperation. While he remained careful not to cross the line into open insubordination, his tone made many uncomfortable. Some viewed him as dangerously provocative, while others quietly agreed with him but lacked the courage to say so. Patton had always been a man ahead of his time, and once again, that made him isolated. The sense of isolation weighed heavily on Patton. He felt increasingly disconnected from the celebratory mood around him. Victory speeches felt hollow. Decorations and honors seemed meaningless when measured against what he believed was coming. He had dedicated his life to defeating tyranny, and now he felt he was watching a new form of it rise unchallenged. The fact that it was happening with the consent of former allies troubled him deeply. In his personal reflections, Patton expressed sorrow as much as anger. He lamented the suffering he believed would follow for people living behind the new lines being drawn across Europe. He feared that millions would lose freedoms they had never even tasted, all because decisions were made to avoid discomfort in the present. Patton believed leadership required the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, even when the cost was high. To him, leaving Berlin symbolized a failure of moral resolve, not just strategic vision. Yet despite his growing disillusionment, Patton did not abandon his sense of duty. He continued to command his troops with professionalism and discipline. He enforced order, maintained readiness, and prepared for whatever future might come. Beneath his frustration was a profound loyalty to the soldiers under his command. They were the reason he restrained his anger, the reason he did not speak publicly in ways that could fracture the fragile peace. His battle now was internal, a struggle between conviction and obedience. As the political landscape shifted and new lines hardened into borders, Patton's warnings seemed increasingly relevant. Reports of tightened control, suppressed dissent, and enforced conformity in Soviet-occupied areas confirmed his fears. Each confirmation strengthened his belief that Berlin had been more than a city. It had been a signal that the West was willing to compromise principles for the illusion of stability. By this point, Patton no longer hoped to change Eisenhower's mind. He knew the decisions had been made and history was already moving forward. What troubled him most was not that he had been overruled, but that he believed future generations would inherit the consequences. His words became less fiery and more somber, filled with the weight of inevitability. He felt like a man who had seen the storm clouds gather, but was powerless to stop the rain. As Patton looked toward the uncertain future, his thoughts grew darker and more reflective. He believed another struggle was inevitable, not because of aggression, but because unresolved conflict always returns in a new form. The battlefield, he felt, had merely changed shape, and in that belief, Patton began to sense that his role in history was nearing its end, even as the consequences of the decision to leave Berlin were only beginning. That realization would define his final reflections, his final words, and the legacy he left behind, bringing the story toward its final and most haunting chapter. As the war officially ended and the world attempted to breathe again, Patton found himself standing in a peace that felt unfinished. The silence after the guns stopped did not bring him relief. Instead, it amplified his unease. He watched as borders hardened, armies repositioned, and former allies began to speak to one another with guarded caution. To Patton, this was not peace, it was a pause. And pauses, he believed, were dangerous when the will to act had already faded. Patton's words during these final months were quieter but heavier than ever before. He no longer spoke with explosive anger, but with grim certainty. He believed the decision to leave Berlin to the Russians would shape the world for generations, creating a divided Europe built on fear rather than freedom. He reportedly said that wars are not truly won when enemies are defeated, but when the conditions for future conflict are removed. In his view, Berlin had been the last opportunity to prevent a new struggle from taking root. By stepping aside, the West had allowed another system of control to entrench itself behind newly drawn lines. As reports emerged from Soviet-occupied territories, Patton felt his fears becoming reality. Restrictions tightened, voices were silenced, movement was controlled. Each new account weighed on him like confirmation of a verdict already delivered. He did not feel pride in being right. He felt sorrow. To Patton, being correct about future suffering brought no satisfaction, only grief that it had been avoidable. He believed history would one day understand the cost of restraint, even if it took decades to admit it. Eisenhower, now focused on rebuilding and maintaining fragile stability, rarely addressed Patton's concerns directly. Their paths, once intertwined by war, now diverged completely. Eisenhower carried the burden of peace, diplomacy, and political responsibility, while Patton remained a warrior trapped in a world no longer willing to fight. Neither man was wrong in intention, but they were fundamentally different in nature. Eisenhower sought to prevent immediate catastrophe. Patton sought to prevent long-term tragedy. Between those two goals lay the future of Europe. In private moments, Patton reflected on his own place in history. He wondered whether soldiers like him were only meant for destruction, not preservation. He believed that societies celebrated warriors during war, only to silence them once peace required compromise. That realization left him feeling increasingly isolated. His instincts, once praised, were now seen as dangerous. His clarity, once valued, was now considered inconvenient. The same qualities that had made him indispensable in war made him uncomfortable in peace. What Patton said about Berlin in his final reflections was not a call to arms, but a warning etched in resignation. He believed that strength used becomes weakness, and that opportunities ignored rarely return. He feared that future leaders would face crises born from decisions made in those final days of the war. To him, leaving Berlin was not just about geography, it was about moral direction. It signaled what the world was willing to tolerate in exchange for quiet. Patton's sudden death shortly after the war gave his words a haunting weight. He did not live to see the division of Germany become permanent, nor did he witness the rise of the Cold War he believed had already begun. Yet as decades passed and tensions hardened into standoffs, many began to revisit his warnings with new understanding. Berlin became a symbol of division, just as Patton had feared. Walls replaced front lines. Ideology replaced artillery, and the world entered a long, uneasy struggle defined by suspicion and restraint. Eisenhower would later lead in a different role, guiding the nation through a tense nuclear age with caution and balance. History would credit him with preventing catastrophe through restraint, just as it would remember Patton for his uncompromising clarity and relentless drive. Their conflict over Berlin became a reflection of two philosophies of leadership: one focused on managing the present, the other on confronting the future head-on. In the end, what Patton said when Eisenhower left Berlin to the Russians was not delivered in defiance, but in warning. It was the voice of a soldier who believed that unfinished wars leave unfinished consequences. His words were not meant to provoke immediate action, but to remind history that peace without foresight can be as dangerous as war without restraint. And as time passed, the world slowly realized that the fall of Berlin was not the final chapter of conflict, but the opening page of a new one, exactly as Patton had feared.